Please turn in those Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to continue our study of 1 Corinthians, which consists mostly of the chewing out of a bunch of very immature Christians. 15 of its 16 chapters have been dedicated to this, and I'm glad I didn't get a letter like this from Paul. The first section of problems that he deals with are problems related to leadership, and top of the list are the division problems. People in the church are quarreling in certain groups in favor of their favorite teachers. And they're saying pretty much that the other teachers have nothing to offer. Why? Because they are convinced that men have the ability to give you understanding of the scriptures. We don't. If you understand anything that I preach from this pulpit, that understanding has come from God. I'm just an instrument that he used, but the understanding has come from him. But the Corinthians thought, nope. Has to do with the ability to persuade, the ability to convince, the eloquence of the messenger, not realizing that it is part of the gospel itself that gives the power to understand. And over the next coming months or years, however long it takes us to get through this, we're going to be taking a look at the nature of the message in the rest of chapter 1 and all of chapter 2. And we're going to see it's divided up into two sections, the poverty of human wisdom and the profit of hidden wisdom. Now, what I mean and what God means by human wisdom is our intelligence, our ability to reason. You understand? What hidden wisdom is the wisdom that is inherent in the gospel message itself. And it is hidden from us until God gives understanding of it. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that even if our gospel is veiled, if you remember, the widows used to wear black at funerals, and they used to have a veil. And you couldn't even see into the veil. There was a reason for that. I call it the Tammy Faye Baker syndrome. All the mascara was running because they were crying, and they didn't want you to see that, so they've got a veil. But even if our gospel is veiled, Paul says, it is veiled only to those who are perishing. Who are the perishing? Those who, at whatever age in their life, they die. They do not go to be with Jesus. They go to hell. Those are the perishing. They don't understand the gospel in a meaningful way. They know what it says intellectually, but it is hidden. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse number 6, which starts that next major section, that we do impart a secret and hidden wisdom from God. God has to unveil it. Why? Because our human wisdom, our ability to reason, no matter how smart we are, just doesn't have what it takes to figure it out so that it's important, so that I realize that my sinfulness is indeed bad enough to send me to hell. It is that bad, and that to cure it, God had to do something very, very, very awful to his son. That's how mad he was at my sin. And without the unveiling of God's power through the gospel, that's not going to happen, because our intellects are disabled. But the gospel, which is God's revelation, can unlock that part of our mind by regenerating a new spirit in us and giving us Velcro. What? Is that in the Bible? No, but you'll understand after my next illustration. Some of you older people may recognize this beauty up there. That's a 1967 Impala, Chevy Impala. Wow, what a car. And John Testa was the envy of everybody in the school. He had one of these things. And after I was thrown out of the house and I refused to come back and spent half of my senior year living on my own, John, my drinking buddy, and I decided we were going to go to school only 3 days every week. And if we had gone to school Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we'd look at each other and say, well, you know, we've got to take Thursday and Friday off. And no matter what was going on, we always took a couple days off, and we worked on his car. John didn't want to go out in the woods, fishing, hunting, or anything like this. John just wanted to work on this car, whether it needed it or not. So I worked on the car with John. We changed the oil. We'd change the tires. We'd give it a tune-up. I was small enough he could put me down underneath the car and drop the transmission on my chest and yank me out from underneath the car. And in the 6 months that I was doing this, he probably rebuilt that transmission a couple times. And he was always working on this car. And then at night, we'd go out and get drunk. Next day, get back up, either go to school or work on the car. I cannot work on a car. 2 days of every week I was working on this car. I can't change the oil in my car. I can't give it a tune-up. I can't do anything to it because there's no Velcro in that part of my brain. No matter how many times I've been exposed to it or do it or have done it, it just doesn't stick. And we are born without the Velcro in our brain to grasp spiritual truth and to appreciate it. Because God has disabled our intellect. The perception of the gospel gives two possibilities of response. You either reject it or you receive it. The rejection, of course, will be by those who are perishing. Verse number 18 says, "For the word of the cross, that is the gospel, is foolishness to those who are perishing." Now, do they look you right in the face and say, that's stupid? Not in the South. Why don't you move to Vermont? They'll tell you it's stupid, and then they'll use some four-letter words up there too. You always know where you stand in Vermont when it comes to things of Jesus Christ. But down here we can pretend because we're in the Bible Belt. But the point is, if you have not received it, and if you are not, because of it, following the Lord Jesus Christ, thinking about him, he has become your life. You like to talk about him. You like to obey him. You like to be pleasing. You like to talk to him. Then you have rejected the gospel. And those are the only two responses that God offers. Verse number 18, you either receive it or you reject it. All right, the plan of the Redeemer. We started last week in verses 19 through 21. Let me read that. As it is written, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will thwart." Where is the wise man? Where's the scribe? Are they following Jesus? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? So his plan for our wisdom or for our intelligence is to render it useless. He's destroyed our ability to appreciate spiritual truth. All right. Now, some ideas are so stupid that only intellectuals believe them. And all the most wonderfully intelligent people in the world are now saying if you're a girl and you want to pretend you're a boy, that's okay. And if you're a child and you want to pretend you're a cat, that's okay too. It's perfectly logical and nothing reasonable makes sense to these people. They are just getting darker and darker in their understanding of things. And it seems like this stuff is coming from the most intellectual people. So That's his plan for our wisdom. But in verse number 21, we see what his plan for his foolishness is. Now, I've got foolishness in quotes because the foolishness that Paul refers to in verse number 21 is actually the gospel itself. And the reason he calls it foolish is because that's the way the world perceives the gospel. He says in verse number 21, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom." In other words, it wasn't because of our intelligence that we came to Jesus Christ. It pleased God through the foolishness of what we preach to save those who believe. So his plan for his foolishness or his gospel is to save people with it. Okay? Now, new material starts right now. That was a long introduction. The perception of the races. Let me read verses 22 and forward just a little bit. "For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified." So how do the races perceive the gospel? Well, first, let me tell you, from God's point of view, there are only two categories of people: believer and unbeliever, saved, unsaved. Got it? Two categories. In each of those categories, there are two races. You are either a Jew or you are a non-Jew. Sometimes a non-Jew is referred to as a Gentile. In this context, for the Corinthians, Paul refers to the non-Jew as a Greek because they're right there in the Greek heartland. So, two categories of people, believer or unbeliever, two races of people. So, what is their requirement? They want proof. Oh yeah? So you're saying that God, who supposedly loves his son, punished his son instead of the sinner, put him to death, and then raised him from the dead. What kind of malarkey is that? You've got to prove to me that this is really true, or that there even is a God who would do such a thing. And Paul says Jews demand signs. Jews want wonders. They want miracles. If you're going to prove something to a Jew, it is their nature to say, "Oh yeah? Well, show me a sign." In fact, over here, Moses is out in the wilderness, and he has discovered a burning bush. That's in Exodus chapter 4. And he's talking with God, and God has told him, "Mo, I want you to go back to Egypt, where you fled, even though you were probably being groomed to be the next Pharaoh as a Jew. And I want you to lead my people who went down into Egypt when Jacob was still alive as a party of 75 and are now between 2 and 4 million strong. And I want you to lead them out and into the land that I promised to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Moses said, "I think you need to find somebody else. And besides that, they're not going to believe me." So let's pick it up there. "Then Moses answered, 'But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. For they'll say, Yahweh did not appear to you.' And the Lord said to him, 'What's that in your hand?' And he said, 'It's a rod.' He said, 'Well, throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a poisonous snake." That's what a serpent is. "And again the Lord said to him, 'Put your hand into your bosom,'" or into his garment here. "And he put his hand in there, and he took it out, and his hand was leprous, white as snow. And if they will not believe these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground." So in order to convince the Israelites, when he did go back to Egypt, that God really had appeared to him, Moses had to do these signs before the elders. Why? Because Jews demand signs. They want wonders. Jesus got this too, 1,400 years later. Some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." Speed limit, 55. No, not that kind of sign. They mean a miracle, a sign or a wonder. He'd been doing miracles all along, but they want to see yet another one. In Matthew chapter 16, verse number 1, and the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test him. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. The signs, I don't know what else they were expecting Jesus to do. He had stopped storms. He had raised the dead. He had healed lepers and cripples and blind people and deaf people and mute people. What else can he do? Signs don't produce faith. But Jews want these signs. Even one of his own believing disciples, after Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to 10 of them in a closed room, Thomas wasn't there. And so they told Thomas. Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not there when Jesus came. So the other disciple told him, we've seen the Lord. And he said to them, unless I see his hands and the print of the nails and place my finger in the mark of the nails and place my hand in his side, I will not believe. And I think probably while he's still saying this, Jesus appears and says, hey, Tom, go ahead, put your fingers in there. I don't know if Thomas did. But what does Jesus say afterward? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. You know anybody like that? Raise your hand. You have not seen the risen Lord, have you? And yet you believe that God put him to death and raised him from the dead. Blessed are you. Why? Because miracles, in seeing is believing, doesn't pertain to God. It doesn't produce faith in us. We call that empirical evidence, not imperial. Imperial has to do with royalty. The empirical evidence has to do with our five senses, vision and hearing and smell and taste and touch. If we can't experience it with one of our five senses, then we're not going to believe it. That's pretty much what Thomas said. And this is what the Jews want. They want some tangible, observable proof that what you are saying is really true. Okay? And we're all like that to a certain degree. I mean, we say, you know, if God would, let's say, abolish war. Anybody seen the Sandra Bullock movie where she's an FBI agent undercover in a beauty contest, Miss Congeniality? Okay, and as they come up and they tell a little bit, all the contestants come up and they tell a little bit about themselves. What do they all want? They all want world peace. Okay? Nobody likes war, especially people who have been to war or experienced war in their countries. But if God would abolish war, I mean, he cares so much about us, why doesn't he abolish war? Is he weak? There's probably no God. Look at all the wars we have. And not only that, look at all the disease. What if God would cure cancer or Parkinson's or some other thing? You know? Maybe I'd change my mind about God. If God would provide some sort of tangible, observable proof. Maybe eliminate poverty. There's a lot of poor people in the world. And according to the liberals, most of the problems we have in the world are because of poverty. The happiest I've ever been has been when I was in poverty. And now it gets personal. Well, if God would get me out of debt, Or if God would bring my husband or my wife back, or my child who's left home that I haven't seen or heard from for years, or if God would do this for me, or better yet, if Jesus Christ would just appear right here in front of me, then I would not only believe in him, but I would follow him. So I've got to ask these questions. Will miracles and wonders and tangible evidence produce faith in the heart of the unbeliever? It won't. We think it will, because we've got this saying, seeing is believing, and not when it comes to spiritual truth. Look at this from John chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Jesus' very first miracle, he has turned water into wine, and he's now at the Passover feast in Jerusalem, and many have believed in his name when they saw the signs, that is, the miracles which he had done. But Jesus did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all men and needed no one to bear witness of man, for he himself knew what was in man. Now, does that sound like a real positive thing that they believed in him? Nope. I think just about everybody believes in Jesus. But do they believe the truth about Jesus? A lot of these Jewish people at the time of Jesus believed that he was indeed the coming Messiah, who was there to rescue them from the Romans and to restore all their fortunes and make them the most important country in the world once again. Jesus was not there to do that on his first trip. He will do that when he comes again. But he did not do that on the first trip, and that was not his intention. And there were people who believed in him and were very, very disappointed when Jesus Christ did not do that for them, Judas being example number one. All right? Now, they saw these miracles, but did it produce the right kind of faith so that they believed and followed him? No. And Jesus was not entrusting himself to them. And nobody brings out, like John in his gospel, the difference between belief and belief. Belief that does not save and belief that does save. And John addresses lots of people who are believers, who eventually say, crucify him. So, will miracles and wonders and tangible evidence produce faith in the heart of the unbeliever? I don't think so. In John chapter 3, a very familiar story, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher, having come from God, for no one can do the signs or the miracles that you do unless God is with him. So Nicodemus believes a lot of things. He believes that Jesus really is from God. He believes that Jesus' miracles are not tricks, but they're the real McCoy. And this is how he starts out his introduction to Jesus. And what does Jesus say to him? Nick, you have to be born again. In other words, you have to get saved. Nicodemus believed a lot of things. He even believed that Jesus' miracles were real. But did those miracles produce faith in Nicodemus the Pharisee? No, they did not, because miracles and wonders and tangible evidence, seeing is believing, does not produce faith in the heart of the unbeliever. Now, Jesus Christ is going to come and rescue the church, the true church, out of the world. We call that the rapture. And all believers are suddenly going to disappear from the face of the earth, and then we're going to have on the earth, we're not going to be part of it, a very, very, very bad period of 7 years where God begins making all kinds of catastrophes happen on the face of the earth to get people's attention that he is about to judge them unless they repent. And some of them, actually many of them, do. But right in the middle of this, let me skip ahead and I'll come back to that. Right in the middle of this, Revelation chapter 6, verse 12 tells us, "Behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky," probably referring to meteors or comets, "fell to the earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale, and the sky vanished like a scroll that is rolled up." How many of you have, you've probably seen them, but I doubt anybody has them in their homes anymore, the shades that used to roll up and you would pull down, and sometimes if you let go real good, it would go like that. All right, well, that's what happens with the sky. I want you to keep that in mind. The sky rolls up like, it's in the shape of a scroll, but it's like we would call it a shade. "And every mountain and island was removed from its place, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the generals, and the rich, and the strong," presumably very intelligent people, "and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us, hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand in front of it?'" So there we go. Well, if the Lord would just show himself, and there he does. In the middle of the tribulation, God rolls the sky back and says, "Here I am." And here's Jesus sitting at my right hand, and we are angry. And guess what? The men of the earth, great and small, all know it. They know that God is mad. And what do they say? "I believe. I'll follow you. I'll do it your way from now on." No. Rocks and hills, mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is on the throne and from the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and we're in trouble. And instead of turning to the one who is mad at them, the only one that can rescue them, they still want nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Why? Because miracles and wonders and tangible evidence cannot and does not produce faith in the heart of the unbeliever. Now let me go back to that Hebrews passage here in Hebrews chapter 3. This is a little more extensive. The author says, "But encourage one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." Folks, sin will lead us to believe that we are doing just fine. I mean, after all, I'm a good person. I'm faithful to my wife. I bring my kids up and I feed them and I provide for them and I go to church and I'm okay. God's not going to send me to hell. That's the deceitfulness of sin. For we share in Christ if only we hold our first confidence firm to the end, while it is said, "Today, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion." What rebellion is he talking about? He's going to tell us. "Who were they who heard and yet were rebellious? Was it not all those who left Egypt under the leadership of Moses, and with whom he, that is God, was provoked 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they should never enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient?" So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Now, this group of people that he's talking about, whom God brought out of Egypt, what did they see? They saw the signs that Moses performed, saying, "God has appeared to me," saying, "We're going to leave Egypt." And after that, they saw all 10 of the plagues. They saw the Nile turn to blood. They saw gnats up people's noses. They saw the flies and the grasshoppers, the locusts, which ate all of the crops and the trees and things like that. The hail and the fire that came down from heaven and destroyed any person or animal that was still out in the field. The darkness that was so thick it could be felt. They saw families of Egypt lose the firstborn when the death angel came over because they did not have the blood of the lamb on the outside of their doorway. They watched God do all of this, and the miracles didn't end. On the very day that they were going out, God says, ask all of these Egyptians who hate you for silver and gold and anything else that you might want. And the Egyptians gladly gave it to them. That, folks, is a miracle. And then they went out, and Pharaoh's army said, what have we done? We're going to chase them. And they did, and God opened up the Red Sea. They saw these miracles. They saw the power of God. They went through the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army was drowned. And then for 40 years, God provided miraculously an incredible amount of water before 2 to 4 million people and their flocks and their herds, fed them with manna every day. All they had to do was go out and pick it up and put it in their baskets. They saw Mount Sinai quake and the fire and the smoke, and they heard the voice of the Lord saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And they all perished in the wilderness because the miracles did not and could not produce faith in the heart of the unbeliever. Okay? All right, so let's move on. No amount of evidence, Mark Twain says, will ever produce an idiot. Well, that's, persuade an idiot. Well, that's also a spiritual truth. No amount of evidence is going to persuade an unbeliever. And nobody with the eloquence of Billy Graham can persuade the unbeliever. If the unbeliever is persuaded to follow Jesus Christ, it is because of Jesus Christ. So Jews want wonders, Paul says. Jews demand signs, but Greeks, that is the non-Jewish person, they want wisdom. They want intellectual evidence. Okay? So I can remember a fellow came to me in Vermont who, and you've heard this story before, says, we want you to have a Bible study in our house, or we're not going to become Christians. So why don't you want to become a Christian? He says, because you bozos don't believe in evolution. You think God created all this in 6 days. And I had all kinds of answers in the back of my head that make evolution look stupid. But I kept my mouth shut. And so we did the Bible study, and guess what I was teaching? 1 Corinthians. And I talked about the gospel. And the man got saved. And now his favorite topic is disproving evolution. Isn't that amazing? And he pastors a church down in Ocala, Florida. God has done amazing things through what? So I showed him that evolution was stupid? No. I gave him the gospel. Because no amount of intellectual evidence is going to persuade the unbeliever, and no amount of tangible evidence will persuade the unbeliever. So, that's their requirement. Prove it. And what is our requirement? Look at the rest of the verse. It says, Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, verse number 23, but we preach Christ crucified. That's the gospel. So what's our requirement? To preach. Okay? You don't have to be smart. You just have to know what the gospel is. You don't have to present it in an outstandingly interesting and phenomenal way. You just have to say what the gospel is. In John chapter 9, Jesus has the opportunity to heal a man that was born blind. So, afterward, he's roaming around. Remember, he never did get to see Jesus because Jesus put some ointment in his eyes and sent him to the pool of Siloam to wash it off. He doesn't know what Jesus looks like. So the synagogue rulers are saying, how were your eyes opened? He said, the man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed and I received my sight. And they said to him, well, where is he? I don't know. Do you have to know all the answers, people? No. You don't have to answer all their questions. Just tell them what you know. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind. They said to him, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He said, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And he said to him, oh, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He says, I've already told you and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Why, this is a marvel. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. All he told him was what he knew. And sometimes all you can say is, look, this is the way I used to be. But now, all day long, I think of him. And I'm grateful for what he did to me, because I was in danger of spending eternity in a lake of fire. He didn't have to love me. He didn't have to put up with me. He could have snuffed me out at any moment. But while I was yet a sinner, Christ died for me. That's all you got to say, folks. The greatest tangible evidence that an unbeliever has is what he sees in our lives because of Jesus Christ. And that'll hold a lot of water. Our requirement is to preach. And what is their reaction? Their reaction, verse number 23, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. They think it's preposterous. In fact, there you have it. That's the dumbest thing I've heard all day long. I used to substitute teach when I was pastoring a church in Vermont. And I had a favorite school, well, two favorite schools. And there was one teacher who always called me, Jim, can you substitute for me today? And I knew all the teachers, and schools were very small. This K through 8 school probably didn't have 100 students in it. And so there was only just a few teachers, and most of us were eating lunch together one day, and we're just having a conversation about who knows what. It wasn't spiritual things, because I don't think there was a single believer at that school. And then Paul Simmons, the science teacher, comes in, sits down at the head of the table, and without even saying hello, absolutely attacks me. You Christians, you just absolutely reject science. And he just goes on and on. And the other teachers at the table are looking at him like a demon has come into him. And I'm just sitting there taking it, because all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Wasn't that part of our scripture reading this morning? Okay. And he says, that's just, you're stupid. I said, Paul, the sun, it's shrinking. Yeah, so? I says, Paul, it's shrinking 5 feet every hour. And if the earth were really any closer or further away from the sun, it wouldn't be able to sustain a life. So if the sun was a lot larger, that means it'd be a lot closer to the earth, because it's shrinking. It used to be bigger. He goes, what's your point? I says, Paul, only a few million, not a few billion, but a few million years ago, the sun would have been the size of the entire elliptical orbit of the earth. You know how dinosaurs died? He goes, how? I says, sunburn. I says, Paul, how can the universe be as old as you scientists say that it is, given that information which you yourself have taught in science class? It just made Paul madder. So that doesn't work, folks. The gospel is what works. And that's why our requirement is to preach Jesus Christ and Him crucified.